Today I'm looking at whether AMD has fixed FSR Frame Generation. Now, if you haven't been following our coverage of FSR Frame Generation, you might not be aware that the feature is actually broken, or at least it's broken in one specific and annoying way, dating right back to the debut of this technology in 2023. The last time I looked at FSR Frame Gen, which was at the big launch of AMD's Redstone suite of technologies, it was still broken, and across the last 9 months or so, I haven't really looked into whether AMD has been able to fix it. But since Redstone's release in December 2025, there have been a couple of potential avenues that AMD could have used to slip in some fixes and updates. When I first tested the ML-based version of AMD's Frame Generation, it was provided via a driver upgrade solution, taking existing FSR 3.1 implementations and upgrading them to FSR Redstone on the fly. Today, games have started to integrate FSR 4 Frame Gen natively, using a proper DLL from AMD source code releases. Perhaps doing it natively rather than via an upgrade brings some fixes. AMD has also updated FSR Frame Gen itself to version 4.0.1 and updated the FSR SDK to version 2.3.0 since I covered Redstone. The changelogs don't mention any specific fixes relating to frame pacing, but you never know, it has been 8 months, so we'll check out all of that today after a word from our video sponsor, Ori.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Ori and their VC8KT USB 3 external HDMI capture device designed for professional recording and streaming applications, supporting HDMI input resolutions up to 8K at 60Hz and 4K at 144Hz, while capturing video at up to 4K at 60 FPS. It also features an HDMI loop out, microphone input, and 3.5mm line in and line out ports for flexible audio and video integration for advanced production setups. Powered by USB 3.2 Gen 1 with up to 5 gigabits per second bandwidth, it ensures smooth, low latency video transmission. Multiple capture formats including YUY2, NV12, I420, and MPEG are supported, as well as HDR, making it suitable for a wide range of workflows. Fully compliant with UVC and UAC standards, the best part is this device requires no drivers for a true plug-and-play experience. It's compatible with Windows 7, 10, 11, Mac OS, and Linux, and works seamlessly with popular software such as OBS, Streamlabs, vMix, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and more. So for more information, please check the links in the video description.
So what is the problem with FSR Frame Generation? The answer is frame pacing. This technology can interpolate between two rendered frames with decent quality, and it can produce these generated frames to look like the perfect midpoint between the rendered frames. It can even produce the rendered frames and generated frames at a steady, consistent pace so that frame time charts measuring the GPU output look stable. But then it all falls apart when these frames actually get delivered to the display. I first brought this up when assessing FSR 3 Frame Generation back in 2023. At the time, FSR 3 Frame Gen was capable of increasing the frame rate as intended and doing the usual interpolation, though at the time without the assistance of machine learning. But when I was actually playing games, the output wasn't as smooth as I would have liked. FSR 3 would often show an output of, say, 120 FPS, but the gameplay experience wasn't equivalent to 120 FPS in smoothness. And this wasn't related to the latency penalty associated with Frame Gen, rather the actual smoothness of the output as delivered to the display. When retesting FSR Frame Gen at the launch of Redstone, I found similar problems. Frame rate numbers go up, but frame pacing remained jittery and lacking the proper smoothness you'd expect from the higher frame rate. When directly comparing FSR Frame Gen to DLSS Frame Gen, you could clearly see the better and more consistent frame pacing of Nvidia's solution compared to AMD's in the exact same games. Digital Foundry discovered the same phenomenon in their testing, which used FCAT to measure frame time consistency rather than the slow motion cameras we were using. The main problem that FSR Frame Gen would deliver is what I like to describe as a double tap in output frame pacing. Normally what you want with game rendering is a consistent, even interval between frames being shown on your display. When viewing slow motion footage, you should see that consistency, which helps give the feel of smoothness during gameplay. With FSR Frame Generation, instead of getting that even frame timing, a pace of etc., as we can see in this DLSS footage, I often saw unevenness. In this footage, you'll see that effect from an uneven output being sent to the display. Even though the frames are being generated at an even rate, for whatever reason, one frame is displayed for longer than the other, giving a distinct double tap, da-da, 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 and so on. This happened in most of the games I looked at, and it didn't matter what configuration I was using, whether it was VSync on or off, variable refresh on or off, the output judder remained in most of the titles I explored. It also ended up being more noticeable at lower frame rates, where the output of frame generation gives a larger smoothness increase. For example, there were times when I was doing 60 to 120 FPS frame gen, but moving around or panning the camera did not feel like true 120 FPS. If the judder was bad enough, the frame gen output could actually just look and feel like 60 FPS. But then at higher frame rates, like an output of 200 FPS, the magnitude of these judders reduced and it became a bit harder to spot without the aid of slow motion cameras. Unfortunately, as frame gen is a tool to improve smoothness, failing to actually improve smoothness in crucial use cases is a bit of a fail, and it made FSR frame generation hard to recommend. So let's revisit how frame generation works today on the Radeon RX 97 TXT with the latest drivers, version 26.7.1 as of when I put this video together. The FSR frame generation driver upgrade toggle is enabled for all games. The slow motion footage in this video, well, it isn't the best quality, but it's 960 FPS and it allows us to view frame pacing, which is the main point of today's testing. I'll start here with some titles that I previously looked at to see whether AMD has made any driver level improvements to address frame pacing. Here's Cyberpunk 2077, and we have a couple of hard to see frame counters on the screen. In the top left corner, we have the refresh rate of the display, as reported by the MSI MAG321 UPX that I'm using here. And then in the right corner, we have PresentMon showing the current in-game average frame rate. When I pan around in this area, you can quite clearly see the double tap effect in this heavily slowed down footage. The generated frame is only shown briefly before the screen updates to show the next rendered frame, which remains on screen for longer. There are brief moments where frame pacing appears better, but there are also times where tearing is visible, even though the output frame rate is only 120 FPS, and so well under the display's maximum 240 Hz. Here's Mafia the Old Country, and instead of spinning the camera around, I'm just driving in this town area as normal. The output frame rate with frame generation enabled is around 103 FPS, and you can clearly see again this erratic frame pacing with a double tap type of output. There are some periods where pacing appears to revert to something more normal, but this is not consistent. In this other capture I did in Mafia, I found frame pacing to be a lot more consistent though. This footage does not have a double tap output, even though it was the same gameplay session using the same settings with roughly the same frame rate. Only towards the end did I see a small period of double tapping. In this example in Borderlands 4, I saw pretty decent frame pacing while just walking forwards slowly. No obvious double tap, and with the frame rate in the 90s, it seems the frames are being delivered consistently. Then I hopped on my speeder bike and started moving a bit faster, and here is where I saw frame time inconsistencies again. The refresh rate counter on the display is jumping all over the place, even though the actual frame rate is staying pretty consistent around 98 FPS. God of War Ragnarok was a particularly bad example in my original Redstone review, and it continues to be bad with the latest drivers. Panning the camera around in this location reveals a distinct double tap output, despite a relatively high frame rate around 138 FPS, which means the base render rate of the game is above the 60 FPS that AMD recommends. Some frames are shown on screen so briefly that it induces screen tearing. To confirm this wasn't just from panning the camera around, I did some simple forward running and saw the same sort of double tap output. It's harder to spot because the difference between frames is lower in this situation, but focusing on Kratos' movement, you can clearly see it happening. And then Hogwarts Legacy, same sort of thing, panning the camera, moving forwards normally, flying around on the broom, didn't make a whole lot of difference. Frame time consistency is also poor in this title when using FSR Frame Generation, whether we use the initial FSR 3.1 implementation or the upgraded Redstone version via a driver upgrade. So at this point, I've revisited some of the titles from the original video and explored games that don't use native FSR 4 implementations. These are all FSR 3.1 upgrades, and clearly AMD have not made any improvements at the driver level to address frame pacing in these titles. But what about newer games that have had more time to get accustomed to FSR Frame Generation and that supply a new FSR 4.0 DLL with native support for the Redstone version? First port of call is Crimson Desert, AMD's FSR Redstone launch title and one of the few games to integrate FSR Ray Regeneration. Unfortunately, frame generation frame pacing is poor in this title when panning the camera around, with again that double tap output. Like in other titles, the rendered frame is being shown for a longer amount of time than the generated frame, and this causes output judder in these panning scenes. So then I thought, what about moving forwards on a horse? Same sort of thing, unfortunately, still frame pacing issues with FSR Frame Gen enabled, and this is with a frame rate of around 115 FPS, which should be quite smooth if the frames are being delivered to the display consistently. Then as a sanity check, just to make sure the GPU is working properly, I decided to disable frame generation and lower settings so that the frame rate improved to around 90 FPS. Here, without frame gen enabled, frame pacing was much better and has a consistently paced output on my display. In practice, this configuration felt better to play as it was smoother and less juddery. LEGO Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight had better frame pacing with FSR Frame Generation enabled, but still not to the point of being highly consistent. The double tap effect was less pronounced panning the camera around in this scene, although it did occur occasionally. You might see 20 or 30 frames in a row with decent pacing, then 1 or 2 sets of judder, which I guess is better than what I saw in Crimson Desert. When driving forwards, frame pacing was decent for the most part. Again, occasionally I saw double taps here and there, but it isn't the consistent double tapping problem seen in other titles. So this title I would say is more compatible and more usable with FSR Frame Gen enabled. I tried out Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced in a number of different types of motion, whether that's walking forward slowly, running, moving around on rooftops, panning the camera, and in all of these examples, FSR Frame Gen frame pacing wasn't great. Definite double tapping is occurring here, and while it's not as bad as some of the examples I've explored like God of War, this game does not have the smoothness you would expect from a 120 to 150 FPS output. Unlike the other titles I've been exploring, Black Flag Resynced was released well after FSR Redstone and contains an FSR4 DLL with a native integration of machine learning based frame gen. It doesn't appear from these examples that the native integration does anything to resolve these frame pacing problems. I've got a couple more examples of recent games. This is Resident Evil Requiem, and the double tap effect here is quite bad, much more noticeable than Black Flag Resynced. Frame generation just doesn't feel smooth in this title at all, with results similar to God of War or Cyberpunk 2077. And this was even the case in scenes I felt were not overly complex, like slowly walking down corridors, which surely shouldn't be much of an issue for a frame interpolation system. Lastly, I've got the most recent FSR Frame Generation release, which is Alan Wake 2. Remedy recently updated this game, literally just a few days ago, to integrate support for FSR4 and ML-based frame generation. That's a nice bonus given the game originally shipped with FSR2, so Radeon owners at least will get a significant increase in upscaling visual quality. Unfortunately though, frame generation in this title is also plagued with frame pacing issues. Double tapping is present whether we are panning the camera or just walking forwards, and this hurts the smoothness of the output. If frame generation worked properly, it would be a nice addition because using the path tracing modes is extremely demanding on AMD hardware, and the slower pace of gameplay with a third-person perspective is highly compatible with frame gen in my opinion. With frame pacing issues though, it's not as impressive as it should be. At the end of the day, we're 8 months on from the release of FSR Redstone with ML-based frame generation, and nearly 3 years on from the original release of FSR Frame Generation, and yet frame pacing continues to be an issue with AMD's version of this technology. Compared to DLSS Frame Gen, FSR Frame Gen is just not as smooth or consistent at the same output frame rates. It's been an issue since day one, and I've seen little to suggest it's been improved with newer releases. The degree to which frame pacing is a problem does vary between titles. Some games like God of War and Resident Evil Requiem were super bad with a pronounced double tap and poor smoothness. Other titles would still double tap throughout all types of gameplay, but not as severely, and a couple of titles only double tap occasionally, with some types of gameplay or some scenes showing consistent frame pacing. It is possible for the technology to deliver good frame pacing, it just doesn't happen often enough across a broad sample of games running at different frame rates or using different engines. At times during this testing, I thought certain aspects were tripping up FSR Frame Gen, like perhaps larger differences between frames led to additional processing and worse frame timing, or perhaps fast motion in games with lots of asset loading slightly crippled the Radeon card in a way that hurts the GPU's ability to correctly space generated frames. But in some titles like Resident Evil Requiem, the problem rears its head without much movement at all, and in some other games it didn't really matter what was happening in the game, judder just occurred all of the time. Frame pacing is a pretty significant limitation to FSR frame generation in my opinion. The whole point of this technology is to improve the smoothness of the gaming experience, inserting frames perfectly between rendered frames to boost the output, improve motion clarity, reduce blur, improve smoothness, that whole thing. When working correctly, this is exactly what frame generation delivers, and it can be genuinely useful for those with high refresh rate displays that can properly show everything FrameGen produces. When the output judders like FSR FrameGen judders, the increase in smoothness is eroded. In really bad cases of poor frame pacing, FSR FrameGen doesn't feel like a smoothness increase at all. The game might say it's running at 120 FPS, but visually it looks like 60 FPS and it plays like 60 FPS too. You might even see screen tearing where you shouldn't. These are not issues using DLSS frame generation in my experience, which almost always paces frames correctly. I'm not really sure what the issue is here either. I can't tell you why FSR frame generation doesn't work properly, just that there is something happening between the GPU's output and these frames being delivered to the display that breaks frame pacing. It should work better than it does, yet AMD doesn't seem to have made any progress on resolving the problems it has. It means that anyone interested in frame generation should ignore Radeon GPUs entirely and just buy GeForce. I still think it's fixable, but it's possible the fix is not going to be easy to implement. If the fundamental FSR frame gen code needs a rework, it may not be something that can be deployed to existing games. Don't know if we'll ever get a fix, of course, I'm just trying to be hopeful here. Anyway, that's it for this updated look at FSR frame generation in the middle of 2026. Don't forget to check out the Ori capture card, which I think is a really great product. Links to that is in the description below. Down there, we also have links to things like our Patreon account. If you want to sign up and join, to support Hardware Unboxed directly, all the independent testing that we do, you can get access to some pretty cool benefits, Discord chat, monthly live streams, BTS content, plenty of other good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.